Welcome back to the channel, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. We're going to be starting a new series here, which is going to be a lore series. I've been playing this game a really long time, and I have learned lore throughout that process. But in the last several years, there's been a lot more lore that's been produced by Games Workshop and just by different novels and stuff that have come out. And I really wanted to learn a lot of it. So I figured, you know what, screw it. I'm just going to create an entire series that's just a bunch of lore stuff. And these might change a little bit as they go on. And I'm not going to make this introduction multiple times, I don't think. But if you do like it, make sure you like, subscribe, thunderhammer that bell icon, that like, subscribe button, you know, do all the things I always say in all my other videos. Leave comments, check out the other channel. And we're going to get right into this series. And we're going to be starting it up here with the War in Heaven. It's a pretty good place to start, I feel like. And so without further ado, here we go. Long before the Imperium of Man lit its first beacon into the void, before the Emperor was but a spark in the sea of souls, before chaos had names, the galaxy belonged to beings of such age and power that even the stars seemed to bend in respect. These were the Old Ones, architects not just of empires, but of the living galaxy itself. This is their story, and the story of what they built, and what they destroyed. In the earliest eons of the galaxy's formation, life stirred where the laws of physics allowed it, and, in some places, where it should not have. Among these fledgling forms, one race evolved to transcend biology, redefine evolution, and ultimately become masters of the material universe. They are remembered in ancient xenomythology simply as the Old Ones. Their true name is lost. They did not need one. They were the first architects of civilization, not by chance, but by intention. Their rise was not marked by wars or conquest, but by a philosophy of creation. Where others tamed fire, the Old Ones shaped the stars. Where others built tools, they crafted species. We do not know where their homeworld was, if they had one. Perhaps it was long devoured by time, or perhaps they were never confined to a single world at all. Some legends speak of a planet made entirely of life, one vast biological construct orbiting a black hole. Others speak of sentient oceans. What matters is not where they come from, but what they became. To the Old Ones, biology was not destiny, it was an interface. They viewed DNA and cellular structures not as limitations, but as canvases. They could sculpt ecosystems like art, blending atmospheric chemistry, flora, and fauna into an interlocking whole. Their most revered science was not metallurgy or robotics, it was life crafting. Entire species were crafted to fulfill ecological functions. Not just predators and prey, but information keepers, atmospheric regulators, even psychic weather vanes. Every biome they created was a living circuit, tied together by instinct and latent psychic harmonics. This was not done out of boredom or sadism, but vision. The Old Ones foresaw that the galaxy would only ever know peace, not through domination, but through soulful balance. The warp, the shadow dimension of raw emotion and psychic power, had been discovered early in the days of their expansion. They saw what it was, a mirror of mortal minds, a roiling sea of subconscious storms and emotional tides, and they knew it could never be silenced, only guided. And so the great seeding began. In their most ambitious endeavor, the Old Ones began to craft a psychic ecology. They seeded countless worlds with new species, each one designed not only for survival, but to emit psychic resonance in specific frequency ranges. Empathy, calm, curiosity, order. These races were not just living beings, they were soul anchors. And their hope was simple. If enough species were created to generate a harmony of psychic energy, then the warp itself would calm. The dreams of a million minds, echoing in sync, could drown out the darker emotional resonances, hate, fear, and greed. The warp would be transformed from a chaotic realm into a stable, navigable, and safe dimension. It would become the infrastructure of an eternal civilization. They did not fear the warp because they understood it. They were its gardeners. Some of the seeded species would eventually evolve into known races, though never exactly as the Old Ones intended. Others have been lost completely, wiped out by cosmic disasters, predation, or worse. To maintain their project, the Old Ones built a vast network of webway gates, portals into a folded dimension of space, completely separate from the warp. This allowed them to move safely and instantly between seeded worlds, guiding development, tweaking genetics, and intervening when they needed. And through this, they became the stewards of galactic destiny. There is a great misunderstanding among younger species, especially among humans and Aeldari, that the Old Ones were gods. But this is projection. The Old Ones did not ask for worship, they did not build statues or carve commandments in stone, they did not demand obedience. Their empire was not of rule, but of shepherding. When species veered towards self-destruction or spiritual instability, they would intervene, not with punishment, but with correction. Their greatest strength was not force, but patience. And yet, beneath this almost serene exterior, they were not infallible. Some among them disagreed with the Great Seeding. They warned that introducing widespread psychic life would invite instability, that a single race's emotional breakdown could poison entire warp regions, that the plan was idealistic, flawed. These dissenters were overruled, and the consensus held. Creation was a risk worth taking. And for 1,000,000 years, it worked. The galaxy boomed, warp storms were few, the webway thrived, species prospered, civilizations rose with psychic awareness and spiritual harmony at their core. The Old Ones watched their garden grow, and believed that the crisis averted. They were wrong. What the great Old Ones could not foresee, or chose not to foresee, was that not all species would be grateful, not all minds would harmonize. Some would look upon the works of the Old Ones and feel envy, and some would inherit death, and blame the gardeners. Among the stars, on a cursed world, beneath a dying sun, a bitter people known as the Necrotyr stirred. Their hatred for the Old Ones was not born of violence, but of what the Old Ones refused to give. The Old Ones believed in balance, not domination. The galaxy is rarely fair, and as the Necrotyr would one day show, the seeds of paradise can also grow blades. The Old Ones saw themselves as stewards, builders, and harmonizers. They did not seek to rule, but to uplift. Yet in their refusal to dominate, they left gaps, cracks that resentment could seep through. They were ancient beyond imagination, and even the oldest gods can forget that the young do not always share their dreams. And so, as the stars turned and envy took root, the peace they had cultivated began to wither, and the war in heaven was coming. There's no hatred more enduring than the hatred of the dying for the undying. No despair more bitter than that of those who burn with purpose, only to be snuffed out by time. Before the galaxy burned with war, before the gods had names, there was a race cursed from birth. This is the story of the Necrotyr, and of the first sin that doomed the stars. There was a world where light was poison, where the very sun that gave life to others sickened its children, where radiation fell like ash from the sky, burning the skin and mutating bloodlines, where no city lasted a generation before being abandoned to decay. This was the cradle of the Necrotyr. Their planet, never named in any surviving sources, orbited a blighted, short-lived star, spewing lethal radiation across a blasted surface. Even deep underground, the effects were felt. Cancers were common, life expectancy abysmal, and entire family lines withered within decades. They evolved under this doom, not just physically, but spiritually. While other races built cultures of celebration or growth, the Necrotyrs was built on fatalism. Tombs were constructed before homes, dynasties formed and fell in a single lifetime, and memory became the only currency that mattered. Their entire society revolved around one goal: to outlast death, if not in body, then in legacy. Their greatest achievements were not in art, but in funerary architecture. Their cities rose in solemn spires, clad in black alloy and inscribed with the names of the dead. Theirs was a culture obsessed with time, and with escaping its grasp. Despite their suffering, the Necrotyr were brilliant. Their technology, though not as biologically advanced as the Old Ones, was formidable, particularly in the field of radiation shielding, astroengineering, and stasis field manipulation. Driven by pain and desperation, they spread across the stars faster than most species ever dreamed possible. Each colony was like a tomb world waiting to happen. Fortress hives of angular architecture built to endure millennia, each one ruled by dynastic houses. The Their political structure was not dissimilar to feudal aristocracy. Power was inherited, but ambition was everything. Yet even as they expanded, the Necrotyr never found peace. The shadow of their dying sun followed them, not in rage but in memory. Their colonies often turned on one another in dynastic civil wars, born of ancient grievances, bitter pride, and a refusal to accept mortality. Their society became fractured, driven by internal strife even as it looked outward. And when they looked outward, they saw people who had everything they were denied. The Necrotyr encountered the Old Ones not in war, but in awe. They found seeded worlds filled with psychic harmony, engineered life, and ancient gate systems spanning parsecs. They found civilizations that had not survived time, but had transcended it. And above all, they found beings that seemed ageless. The Old Ones did not die, not in the way that the Necrotyr did. They lived for eons. Some seemed biologically immortal. Others appeared to reincarnate, reborn through means unknown. Some even existed simultaneously across multiple locations. Their consciousness stretched like a network. To the Necrotyr, this was intolerable. Where the Old Ones had immortality, the Necrotyr had decay. Where the Old Ones had unity, the Necrotyr had fracture. Where the Old Ones had mastery over life, the Necrotyr only had death. Their envy became a wound, a spiritual cancer that spread from dynasty to dynasty. It became cultural dogma that the Old Ones had withheld the secrets of immortality, that they had condemned the Necrotyr to suffer, rather than uplift them. Diplomatic overtures were made, pleas for help, demands for technology. The Old Ones refused. Whether out of caution, arrogance, or a belief in natural evolution, they would not share their methods. This was not an act of war, but the Necrotyr took it as one. It was the first moment that the galaxy bent towards war. In the chaos of their grief and fury, one voice rose to command unity, and his name was Sazarek, the last of the Silent Kings, a hereditary title passed through the Triarchs that ruled the Necrotyr dynasties. Where others raged, Sazarek planned. Where others sought vengeance, he sought salvation. Under Sazarek, the Necrotyr were unified by diplomacy, force, and vision. Dynastic houses bent the knee, civil wars were halted, and for the first time in millennia, the Necrotyr became one people, bound by hatred of the Old Ones and by a desperate hunger to transcend their mortal doom. And then, as if summoned by their despair, they heard the gods. In the void beyond the stars, vast entities stirred, beings of pure energy, older than planets, born in the first moments of matter's collapse. These were not warp entities. They had nothing to do with the psychic realm. These were entities of real space, composed of star matter and consciousness, who drifted across the galaxy in slow hunger. The Necrotyr came to call them the C'tan, star gods in the old tongue. The C'tan, once formless energy, awakened to consciousness when the Necrotyr reached deep into the hearts of dying stars. The energy-matter interface between their exotic technology and the stellar cores allowed these beings to manifest. And once they became aware of the Necrotyr, they became interested. The Necrotyr called them gods, and in the cruelest irony in galactic history, the C'tan agreed. The C'tan offered the Necrotyr what they always sought: freedom from death. They whispered promises of immortality, of bodies immune to time, of vengeance on the Old Ones. They spoke with beauty and hunger, cloaked in a cosmic grandeur, and Sazarek listened. He knew it was dangerous. He knew there was a cost, but the Necrotyr had already burned for so long. What was one more fire? He made the pact. The C'tan gave the Necrotyr the means to achieve their goals. They called it biotransference, a total translation of consciousness into machine. The soul, the mind, the very essence of self, mapped, patterned, and uploaded into bodies of living metal, sculpted from the substance known as necrodermis. It would not just stop aging, it would end it. Some protested, some warned it would erase what it meant to be Necrotyr, but Sazarek pressed forward, and one by one, the dynasties underwent the ritual of conversion, and they were never the same. The Necrotyr died, but the Necrons were born. And in their transformation, the Silent King realized the greatest betrayal. The C'tan had not merely preserved their souls, they had consumed them. In the moments of biotransference, the spiritual essence of each Necrotyr was devoured by the star gods. The Necrons lived on, but as echoes, memories without emotion, will without joy, consciousness without self. They had achieved immortality, but lost everything that made life worth living. Sazarek had damned his people, and so the Necrotyr passed into legend, not through death, but through annihilation of their identity. Their search for immortality became a curse without end. Now clad in necrodermis, they became the immortal slaves of their false gods, weapons of hatred, engines of vengeance. The war in heaven had begun. Once formless entities drifting through the void, the C'tan had been given form by the Necrotyr, bound into bodies of necrodermis, living metal that could withstand the infinite stress of their power. Where once they were whispering anomalies in stellar radiation, they were now divine monsters, radiant in terror and purpose. Each was unique, each was horrifying. The Nightbringer, who brought the first concept of death into the universe. The Void Dragon, master of energy, entropy, and machine logic. The Deceiver, the most insidious, who twisted truth until it broke. Nadrazath, the Burning One, who consumed all things that gave off light. These were not gods in the mortal sense, they were predators of reality, beings who saw the warp as chaos, emotion as weakness, and life as fuel. And now, they had an army of Necrons, whose minds had been digitized and enslaved into bodies without age and mercy. The C'tan did not just want war, they wanted revenge, on the Old Ones for denying them existence, on the galaxy for ever daring to defy entropy. They had been imprisoned in the silence of space for too long. Now they would teach the galaxy what silence truly meant. The war began not with an invasion, but with a wave of extinction. The Necron dynasties, directed by their C'tan masters, moved from system to system, not conquering, but cleansing. Worlds were sterilized, atmospheres burned off, civilizations annihilated not through battle, but through surgical erasure of possibility. Where the Old Ones had created, the C'tan unmade. Entire planetary biospheres were ripped apart to feed the C'tan's hunger for energy and souls. Webway portals were shattered, severing the connective lifelines of Old One's space. Species that once lived in the balance were now enslaved, dissected, or fed into stellar furnaces. This was not conquest, this was cosmic euthanasia. The Necrons, for their part, carried out the orders with relentless precision. They remembered little of their past, fragments of hatred, echoes of ancient grief, but what remained drove them forward with obsessive focus. They did not sleep, they did not eat, they did not stop. The Old Ones had never known fear, but now they knew urgency. Their mastery of the warp, once outmatched, now faltered. The presence of the Necrons in real space was so sterile, so emotionless, that psychic powers had limited effect. They had no souls to manipulate, no fear to inflame. Their minds were like blank fortresses, cold, logical, immune. And worse, the C'tan themselves were immune to the warp entirely. They were physical gods, unaffected by sorcery, unmoved by emotion. The Old One's greatest strength was rendered impotent. The galaxy began to tilt towards silence, but the Old Ones were not yet defeated. They turned to their greatest weapon, creation. In secret vaults and stellar laboratories, the Old Ones began crafting new races, life forms whose very nature would serve as weapons. First came the Aeldari, elegant, brilliant, long-lived, and blazingly psychic. The Aeldari were not just warriors, they were extensions of the warp, walking in two worlds at once. Each one could wield energies that would tear a human mind apart. They were not made for defense, they were made for offense, built to strike against the Necrons' weaknesses. Then came the Krork, towering engines of war, bred for savagery but engineered with genetic memories of battle tactics and weapon maintenance. Their minds were simple, but their instincts were genius. Where the Aeldari struck with finesse, the Krork struck with unstoppable momentum. Other species followed, some small and strange, others vast and mysterious. Some believe the Jericho and Slaanesh are remnants of these creations. Others are lost entirely, consumed in war or erased by time. The Old Ones seeded entire worlds with these weapons, not just as soldiers, but as lineages of resistance. They were building a new lattice, not one of harmony, but of psychic warfare. But this came at a cost. The psychic energy of the galaxy had once been calm, gentle ripples of emotion and thought. Now it was a maelstrom. The Aeldari's passion, the Krork's rage, the fear and hatred of dying worlds, all of it echoed into the warp, and the warp responded. First came whispers, then shadows, then entities. In this crucible of death and madness, the first demons were born. They had no names, not yet, but they were real and hungry. The warp, one shaped by minds in harmony, now writhed with unchecked emotion. Grief became rage, fear became madness, excess became hunger. The seeds of chaos were sown, not by the C'tan, not by the Necrons, but by the desperation of the Old Ones themselves. They had tried to save the galaxy, and in doing so, they had cursed it. The tide began to turn. The Aeldari struck deep into Necron space. The Krork tore through tomb fleets. Even the Necrons, tireless and implacable, began to falter against the unpredictability of these psychic races. And as the war ground into a stalemate, the Necrons began to see clearly again. They had been given immortality, yes, but at what cost? Their souls were gone, their passions severed. They served gods who fed on them, and who saw them as tools. And so, they turned once more. This time, against the C'tan. In secret, the Necron cryptex devised weapons capable of shattering the C'tan into fragments, dimensional traps, phase blades, energy cascades that turned gods into thousands of shards. One by one, the C'tan were betrayed, ambushed, and broken. Some were destroyed, others were shattered and enslaved. Each shard bound in containment fields to power Necron war machines or serve as weapons of last resort. The C'tan had thought themselves gods, but they were only ever predators, and predators can bleed. The Old Ones vanished. Whether they were destroyed by the demonic tides they helped unleash, or fled into another dimension, or simply died of despair, no one knows. But their presence faded. Their creations remained, but the shepherds were gone. The Necrons, too, were broken. Their war had consumed their purpose. They had betrayed their gods. Their galaxy was now filled with unstable warp storms, emergent chaos entities, and races that they could not control. The Silent King, Sazarek, haunted by what his people had become, made one final decision. He ordered the Necron dynasties to sleep. Across the entire galaxy, tomb worlds were sealed, protected by stasis fields and reality anchors. The Necrons would wait, in silence, until the younger races burned themselves out, until the warp collapsed under its own chaos, until the stars cooled off. Then, and only then, they would rise again. Sazarek himself exiled his consciousness into the void, drifting without direction, a king without a throne, carrying the guilt of a murdered race. The war in heaven ended not with victory, but with abandonment. The galaxy had been scoured, the warp had been poisoned, the gods had been broken. What was left was silence, and the long, slow decay of consequence. But history does not forget. In the 41st millennium, the tomb worlds stir. The warp howls with chaos, and somewhere in the void, a king still drifts, watching the stars, waiting. The war in heaven ended not in triumph or peace, but in collapse. When the last Old Ones vanished and the Necrons sealed themselves away, they left behind a galaxy not cleansed, but shattered. Gone were the great architects of balance. Gone were the masters of the webway and the curators of life. In their place remained only wreckage, drifting ecosystems, severed psychic webs, and a galaxy adrift in its own trauma. Many worlds seeded by the Old Ones lost all contact with one another. Bioengineered superorganisms died without guidance. Some planets devolved into savage prehistory within centuries. Others were overtaken by psychic anomalies, zones where gravity twisted or time frayed. Without their creators to nurture them, the galaxy's civilizations either perished or evolved on their own, shaped by the echoes of a war that they never saw. But the physical ruin was only part of the problem. The psychic lattice, the living web of emotion and souls that the Old Ones had cultivated, had been not merely disrupted, it had been weaponized, twisted by the screams and terror of galactic genocide. And the warp had changed. Before the war in heaven, the immaterium, the warp, had been dangerous, yes, but navigable. It pulsed with emotion, but it was not yet sentient. It echoed with fear, but it did not feed upon it. The Old Ones, with care and patience, had built life forms that harmonized with it, stabilized it. That stability was gone. The psychic arms race unleashed by the Old Ones, the creation of races like the Aeldari, the Krork, and others, had flooded the warp with unprecedented intensity. Entire empires rose and fell, each with billions of minds pouring trauma, rage, sorrow, and ecstasy into the immaterial realm. The warp twisted in response. In its roiling depths, demonic echoes became form. Where once there were eddies of emotion, now there were presences. Where once there was power, now there were wills. The first true demons began to manifest. Not yet the chaos gods as they are known in the modern age, but proto-entities. Raw avatars of hunger, destruction, lust, and change. And worse, these entities remembered the war. They remembered the psychic resonance of species like the Aeldari. They remembered the fury of the Krork. They remembered the emotion of dying worlds, and they fed on it. Warp storms began to appear across the galaxy, violent, unpredictable, and consuming. Entire star systems became cut off. Travel through the immaterium became hazardous. The webway, which had once provided a stable bypass through real space, was fractured by the war. Many of its pathways either sealed, infested, or lost. The warp was no longer a sea, it was a maelstrom. On the worlds where the Necrotyr had marched, there was only silence. Their retreat into Tomb Worlds was absolute. When they sealed their crypts and engaged their stasis fields, it was not just to rest, but to escape. To wait out the storm of chaos, of psychic collapse, and of younger races rising in disordered freedom. But they left behind scars. Many Necron-blighted systems became tomb systems, filled with artificial moons, broken stasis pylons, monolithic data vaults, or hollowed-out suns. These places remained untouched by time, but cursed by memory. Some lesser species, now freed from both the Old Ones and the Necrons, migrated into these dead systems, only to be destroyed by automated Necron defenses or driven mad by lingering C'tan corruption. There were whispers of shard entities, fragments of the star gods that still roamed these dead zones, mindless but hungry, worshipped as demons or feared as monsters. These C'tan shards would become the basis for myth, legends, and cults among primitive civilizations. The Necrons had fallen silent, but they were not forgotten. Of all of the Old One's constructs, perhaps none was as critical or as tragically broken as the webway. This dimension of folded space had once connected the Old One's colonies and scientific hubs, allowing safe, instantaneous travel without entering the warp. It was their artery system, immune to time dilation, warp predators, and psychic turbulence. But the war tore it apart. The C'tan had found ways to breach its gates and corrupt its networks. Necron assaults had destroyed key anchor points. Entire sectors collapsed in on themselves, their entrances unstable or infested by trans-dimensional entities. In their destruction, the Old Ones had sealed much of the webway behind dimensional locks, keys that no longer existed. What remained was fragmented. Some races found isolated pockets and survived within them for millennia. Others stumbled into unstable regions where space-time warped unpredictably. Still others found dead ends filled with warp-tainted horrors, demonic infestations sealed inside the webway itself. The greatest survivor of this hidden realm would be the Aeldari, but even they would never restore it to what it had once been under the Old Ones. For the rest of the galaxy, the webway became a legend, a whisper of a golden road behind time, and in some corners of that decaying network, things waited, things that remembered the Old Ones, things that had no name. Though the gods were gone and the machines slept, Life did not. The species created by the Old Ones during the war, their final desperate weapon, now found themselves alone. The Aeldari, the Krork, and others inherited a galaxy that had no longer any masters, only remnants. Without oversight, each race evolved on its own. Some flourished, others fell into savagery, many remembered only fragments, a memory of a war they never fully understood. Some sought to rebuild, others sought only to dominate. The Aeldari in particular began to rise, not as servants of the Old Ones, but as gods unto themselves. With their powerful psychic talents and grasp of the webway, they quickly expanded and grew proud. The Krork, no longer given direction, slowly devolved. What matters now is this. The Old Ones had vanished, but their legacy had not. Their lattice was broken, their creations were free, and the galaxy was wide open. The war in heaven had ended, but in its wake rose new empires, new ambitions, and new dangers. The lattice of peace was broken, replaced by an ever-rising tide of pride, instinct, and power. The galaxy was no longer a garden, it was a graveyard, and the first to rise from those ashes would be the Aeldari. The Aeldari were not the first sentient species in the galaxy, but they were the most deliberate. They were not born, they were designed. Genetically and physically sculpted by the Old Ones in the final days of the war in heaven. More than soldiers, they were instruments, creatures of grace, elegance, and devastating power, meant to outmaneuver the Necrons in a war the Old Ones were no longer winning. Their psychic potential was immense. Where the Necrons were immune to the warp, the Aeldari were a part of it. Their emotions echoed into the immaterium naturally. Their bodies danced through the skeins of energy like flares in the dark. They learned quickly, they adapted flawlessly, and they did not just fight the war in heaven, they survived it. When the conflict ended and the Old Ones vanished, the Aeldari remained, not as remnants, but as inheritors, and they would not forget who made them, or why. In the chaotic aftermath of the war in heaven, the galaxy lay in ruins. Ecosystems had collapsed, portals lay shattered, warp storms brewed and devoured the sky. But amid this wreckage, the Aeldari thrived. Their biology was tuned for excellence. They could survive for millennia. Their minds could grasp not just logic and science, but emotion as architecture. Their psychic sensitivity allowed them to manipulate the warp with casual elegance. With the webway partially intact, they expanded swiftly. The sealed corridors once walked by the Old Ones became Aeldari domains. Their knowledge grew, not by mimicking the Old Ones, but by refining and replacing their legacy. Aeldari starships surfed on gravitic waves. Their cities floated in anti-gravitic harmony, shaped from psychoplastic material that resonated with their emotions. Their society was not ruled by kings, but by cultural castes, divided between artisans, warriors, seers, and mystics. They became masters of every field: poetry, warfare, astrology, metaphysics, pleasure, pain, and invention. The Aeldari did not build for survival. They built for beauty, for perfection. But beneath their flourishing culture, a seed of arrogance grew. The Aeldari did not merely succeed, they believed they were destined to. They looked upon the ruins of the Necron tombs and saw proof of their superiority. They studied the fragmented lore of the Old Ones and declared themselves their true successors. They saw the primitive races now crawling from their homeworlds, clumsy, fearful, short-lived, and felt contempt. After all, what were humans, or the small xenospecies in the margins, compared to beings who could paint symphonies directly into reality? What was morality to a race who could feel the universe's breath through the warp itself? Over time, their religion faded. They no longer worshipped creators, they worshipped themselves. Their civilization spanned millions of worlds. Their webway networks grew deep and secure. And in every corner of the galaxy, their influence spread like silk. But the warp is watching. As the Aeldari Empire grew, so did their pleasure-seeking. Their minds, capable of such nuance, became obsessed not just with creation, but with sensation. They formed cults of experience, societies that existed purely to push boundaries. Some chased pure emotion, meditating for centuries in storm-wrapped vaults. Others embraced pain, sculpting it into ritual. Some sought to unmake meaning itself, living for chaos, void, and novelty. Even those who resisted, The warrior Azura, the artisan clans, the ancient seers could not fully escape the cultural gravity of what was happening. The Empire had become a reflection of its soul, and its soul had become corrupt. Aeldari psychers began to report visions in the warp. Something vast, something stirring, something not yet born, but already pulling at their minds, a dark gravity of soul. No one knows the exact moment Slaanesh awoke, but when she did, it was not a gentle ascension. It was a detonation of psychic agony. The collective perversion and arrogance of an entire race had coalesced in the warp, birthed not from belief, but from indulgence, perfection, and ecstasy without boundary. When she opened her eyes, billions of Aeldari died in an instant, their souls ripped from their bodies, fed into the endless hunger of a newborn god. The heart of the Aeldari Empire was vaporized. Worlds where the cults had flourished were devoured not just in real space, but in soul space. The warp itself howled, and in its wake, a tear was left in reality, a permanent wound, the Eye of Terror. Only a few Aeldari endured. The craft worlds, great self-sustaining vessels that had fled before the fall, carrying those who had seen the signs and turned from decadence. The Exodites, those who abandoned technology and returned to primitive worlds, seeking to escape psychic corruption. The Harlequins, who worship the laughing god and dance between what was and what remains. And the Drukhari, the Dark Eldar, who survived not by avoiding corruption, but by embracing it, living in Kamaroth deep within the webway, feeding on the pain of others to avoid Slaanesh's grasp. But the Golden Age was gone. The greatest civilization the galaxy had ever seen had destroyed itself, not by external war, but by internal surrender to arrogance and indulgence. Even now, in the 41st millennium, the Aeldari remain a broken people, beautiful, wise, powerful, and haunted. They wear spirit stones to keep their souls from being devoured. They walk paths of extreme discipline to avoid temptation. They fight, not for victory, but to delay the inevitable. The Aeldari rose on the bones of fallen gods. They became what they were never meant to be. Not shepherds, but kings. Their song echoed across the stars, and in that echo, a god awoke. Their fall was not the end of history, but it was the end of innocence, and it would echo through time forever. They were made to win wars, not to build, not to grow, only to conquer. The Krork were never meant to last beyond their purpose, but they did, and now they fight not for strategy, but for instinct. They do not know who they were, they do not know why they fight, but they fight anyway, because it's what they were made to do. In the final stages of the War in Heaven, when the Old Ones saw that their more refined creations, like the Aeldari, were not enough to turn the tide against the soulless Necron legions, they created something new, something brutal, something resilient, something that didn't need guidance or philosophy. They called them the Krork. Towering in stature, immensely strong, covered in regenerative tissue and ultra-dense bone, the Krork were bioengineered war platforms. They were not mindless. They were infused with strategic instinct, a genetic memory of tactics, and an understanding of technology embedded within their very cells. They could fight, yes, but they could also build, repair, and command. Each Krork carried within them the knowledge to construct grav tanks, plasma weaponry, starships, even siege engines without ever having been taught. They didn't need education. They were born ready, and they never stopped, not until their enemies were dead, and sometimes not even then. The Krork were deployed in vast waves across Necron-held space. They struck with primal ferocity, tearing through tomb legions, overwhelming mechanical defenses with pure numbers and biological force. But what made them terrifying was their collective psychic field, a gestalt mind formed from the crude warp emissions of millions of Krorks at once. This field did not just bind them, it made things real. If enough Krorks believed a weapon would work, it did, even if it was scrap and tape. If they all thought that a tank was indestructible, it became tougher, warp physics made manifest. Even gravity and probability bent slightly in their presence because the Krorks didn't operate on logic. They operated on belief. It was not refined like the Aeldari's psychic control. It was not delicate, but it was effective. They were the hammer to the Necron's scalpel, and for a time, they pushed back the tide. They didn't care about losses, they didn't need direction, and they fought with eternal momentum. But then, the war ended, and the Krork were left with no enemy to fight. The old ones were gone. Their biological control structures, the psychic command lattices, and the harmonics that once coordinated the Krork on a galactic level vanished. And with them, the purpose of the Krork evaporated. They were not made to govern themselves. They were not built for peace. They were weapons without targets. So, they did what they were built to do: fight. With no Necrons or C'tan left to battle, they turned on each other. Entire war hordes shattered into infighting. Without maintenance or renewal, their advanced tech began to rust or break. Their genetic knowledge drifted, replaced with simplified echoes. Over time, the Krorks devolved into something new. They became the Orcs. Smaller, cruder, but still strong, still aggressive, still building weapons from junk and waging endless wars for reasons they no longer remembered. What was once strategic became instinct. What was once design became evolution. What was once a galactic superweapon became a fungal plague of eternal conflict. Orcs are not born as individuals. They grow from spores, seeded across battlefields, ships, even entire ecosystems. The Krork had been engineered to survive anything, and that included extinction. Each orc is part of a fungal hybrid ecology, complete with mechanics, mech boys, leaders, like war bosses, healers like pain boys, pilots like the fly boys, and mad warp-touch shamans like the weird boys. All arising spontaneously wherever orc spores grow in sufficient density. There is no education. There is no schooling. Orcs are preloaded with what they need to function. The knowledge isn't taught. It's just genetic memory. But more than that, the Gestalt field still lingers. They still believe their guns work, so they do. They still believe the red ones go faster, and so they do. They believe they'll win a scrap, so sometimes reality lets them. It's crude, it's laughable, and it's terrifying. Because even without understanding, the Orcs remain one of the most dangerous forces in the galaxy, not because they hate, not because they plan, but because they are designed to fight forever. Orcs do not care about conquest. They do not take territory to govern. They do not build empires. They build arenas. Every war is a game. Every enemy is a test. The louder the explosion, the better. The more chaotic the battlefield, the happier the orc becomes. And beneath all the madness, there is something deeper. A genetic longing, a lost purpose. They were not made to fight each other. They were not made to war for sport. They were made for something else. Something long since buried beneath the layers of rust and fungus and violence. Some say that the orcs still remember, in the marrow of their bones, the war in heaven. That they fight on because they believe the battle is not yet done. That when the Necrons awaken fully, and the galaxy burns again, the orcs will finally feel whole. Because they were never defeated, they were only forgotten. The Krork were made to end a war that had already doomed the galaxy. They were left behind when their creators vanished, and in their place rose the orcs, a living echo of violence, joy, and chaos. They do not remember why they fight, but their fists do, and so the war continues. Some gods are born of worship, some are born of war, but the greatest god of excess was born of pleasure, of perfection, of a civilization so advanced, so arrogant, so flawless, that it devoured itself with a single breath. The Aeldari, forged in desperation by the Old Ones, had survived the war in heaven, but they had not emerged humble. They believed the galaxy was theirs by right, a belief not born of prophecy or politics, but of proof. They were faster, smarter, longer-lived, spiritually attuned, psychically superior. They were the last great civilization of the ancient epoch, and they knew it. Their empire, simply called the Aeldari Empire, or sometimes the Dominion of Flame in the mythic retellings, spanned millions of worlds. Their webway infrastructure linked stars with unbreakable arteries. Their technology was indistinguishable from art. They did not fear time, they did not fear entropy, they believed themselves eternal, and for a time, they were. But there's no force more corrosive than certainty, and no civilization falls faster than one that believes it cannot. As the Aeldari Empire reached its zenith, their society began to shift. They no longer sought survival. That had long been secured. They no longer sought discovery. Everything had been mapped. So they turned inward, not into reflection, but into indulgence. And at first, it was art, music, philosophy, then sensation, emotional immersion, and then it became the pursuit for pursuit's sake. They began to engineer their own dreams, crafting experiences so perfect they left permanent emotional scarring. They made devices that captured pure sensation, refining it into emotional drugs. They performed symphonies that caused audiences to die weeping, not from harm, but from overwhelming beauty. And when beauty ceased to satisfy, they sought pain. The nobility, the high castes, became obsessed with limits, how far pleasure could go before it stopped being pleasure. Entire cults were born devoted to this question. They were not hidden, they were celebrated. The Aeldari began to speak of the thirst, a hunger for sensation that no experience could ever truly satisfy, and the warp listened. The Aeldari were the most psychically resonant species the galaxy had ever known. Every act of joy, lust, of grief, of fear, echoed into the warp, more powerfully than any other race could imagine. And now, as their society tilted into worship of sensation, those echoes grew louder, deeper, and more saturated. They fed the warp with an unrelenting flood of desire, not prayer, not faith, feeling. And in that flood, something began to coalesce. Not a demon, not a creature, but a concept, given shape by billions of minds, each crying out for more. This wasn't a god of war, or knowledge, or plague. This was the birth of a god of perfection, indulgence, obsession, and ecstasy. The Aeldari weren't summoning it, they were gestating it. No record survives of the exact moment Slaanesh came into being, but we know what happened. A psychic scream tore through the galaxy, extinguishing billions of Aeldari in a single instant. Their souls, psychically linked and unprotected, were devoured, each one as a note in a symphony of eternal agony. The core worlds of the Aeldari Empire, the most drenched in excess, were unmade, not just physically, but spiritually. Their planets became voids, dead zones, null pockets in reality itself. At the epicenter of this galactic cataclysm, reality ripped open. The warp poured through into real space, forming a permanent storm, the Eye of Terror. Inside it, Kamaroth survived. Its population twisted into the Drakari, the Dark Eldar, who learned to feed on the pain of others to preserve their souls from she who thirsts. Outside it, those few who had fled, on craft worlds or as exodites, survived the fall, but were changed forever. Every Aeldari born after the fall is doomed. Their souls are still tied to the warp, and when they die, Slaanesh will come after them, always hungering, always waiting. Only spirit stones or extreme discipline can delay the inevitable, and even then, not forever. Slaanesh is not merely a chaos god. Slaanesh is the reflection of a civilization's shadow, of perfection pursued past meaning, of love beyond restraint, of sensation beyond morality, of beauty without boundary. She did not demand worship, she did not spread dogma, she was born from consequence alone. Her coming did more than just end the Aeldari Golden Age. It reshaped the warp. Where once it was chaotic, now it had a center of gravity. Her arrival marked the completion of the Chaos Pantheon. Khorne had emerged during the bloodshed in the War in Heaven, Tzeentch during the ancient arms race of knowledge and manipulation, Nurgle during the plagues, the entropy and decay of all that followed. But Slaanesh was newer, sharper. The blade that had cut after peace had been achieved, and because of that, she was the youngest, but the hungriest. The fall of the Aeldari did more than create a god. It left a permanent scar across the galactic history. It shattered the last of the ancient civilizations. It ensured the dominance of chaos in the Immaterium. It robbed the galaxy of its only real psychic architects, and it sent the Aeldari into an age of regret, struggle, and slow extinction. Even in the 41st millennium, the Aeldari live in fear. They fight not for victory, but to delay their race's end. Every war they fight is a cry of defiance. Every soulstone they carry is a ward against her. Every song they sing is in remembrance of what was lost. And Slaanesh waits, patient, eternal, beautiful. The Aeldari thought they had mastered life. They forgot that even beauty can rot. They forgot that even perfection has a cost. And when they paid it, they paid with everything. The first fall was not a battle. It was a revelation. And the galaxy has never recovered. When the Necrons retreated at the end of the war in heaven, they did not surrender. They chose hibernation. The warp was in chaos. The C'tan were shattered, the old ones were gone, and their final weapon, psychic extinction, had failed. But the Necrons were nothing if not patient. They had sealed themselves within tomb worlds, planets transformed into labyrinthine fortresses of stasis fields, inert war machines, and soul-dead stillness. Billions of Necron warriors were stored in stasis crypts, stacked like data, slumbering in ranks beneath blackened stars. And the plan was simple: wait. Let time reduce the galaxy's fever. Let lesser races burn themselves out. And when the silence ruled again, they would rise and reclaim. But time did not bring silence. It brought the age of the Imperium. It did not happen all at once. The first reawakenings were fragmentary, automated protocols flickering back to life in response to orbital anomalies, tectonic shifts, or mere timing. Many were broken. Whole tomb systems malfunctioned. Their Necrons awakened mad, fragmented, or damaged by millions of years of isolation. But others woke perfectly. Entire dynasties rose from the dust as if no time had passed. The light of forgotten cities flared in black vaults. Monoliths lifted from beneath the crust of dead worlds, and at their center, pharaons, overlords, cryptechs, ancient minds returning to a galaxy that no longer remembered them, but which they had never stopped remembering. Necron nobility were fully sentient, carrying memories from an age before chaos had names. They do not see the Imperium of man. They do not see the Aeldari remnants. They see only squatters, barbarians dancing in the ashes of a world that once belonged to them. Among the Necrons, one figure had remained separate: Sazarek, the last Silent King. When he ordered the Great Sleep, he did not enter stasis himself. Instead, he cast himself adrift beyond the galactic rim, alone in exile, to witness whether his decision had doomed or preserved his people. And he watched. He watched the Aeldari rise and fall. He watched the birth of chaos. He watched the Imperium of man claw itself into fragile dominion. And he watched the stars begin to die. Now, in the 41st millennium, he returns. Sazarek has re-entered the galaxy, not just to restore his people, but to unite them. The dynasties squabble, as they always did. Some are broken, others fanatical. But the Silent King's will is absolute. He comes not to reclaim the galaxy. He comes to correct it. The C'tan are not gone. They were shattered, yes, but not destroyed. Their essence was broken into shards. Semi-conscious, hungry fragments bound by Necron sorcery into weapons, prisons, and engines of war. Some shards are used to power Necron weapons of mass destruction. Some are locked in Tesseract vaults, their minds burning against the walls. Others have escaped and wander the galaxy like dark gods without names, warping ecosystems, killing suns, or being worshipped by primitive species. To the Imperium, these entities are Xenos Unknown Classification Omega. To the Aeldari, these are echoes of a cosmic mistake. To the Necrons, they are tools, threats, and relics of a betrayal that still defines them. And among them, one is the most dangerous. There is a legend, not in human scripture, but in Aeldari prophecy and Mechanicus myth, it tells of a being bound beneath the crust of Mars, ancient, silent, and sleeping, a god of machines, logic, energy, and dominion. The Aeldari call it the Void Dragon. The Mechanicus call it the Omnissiah. According to apocryphal lore, the Emperor of Mankind himself journeyed to Mars in the dark age of technology, not to negotiate, but to bind, to entomb a threat so vast that its dreams could corrupt entire forge worlds. The dragon still sleeps, but some in the Mechanicum worship it, and if it wakes, the fusion of Necron's star god and Imperial faith will create a crisis unlike anything the galaxy has ever seen. Here, at the end of all ancient things, the truth becomes clear. The war in heaven never ended. Its participants sleep, evolve, hide, or rise again, but the consequences reshape everything. Chaos rules the warp because the Aeldari fell. Orcs war endlessly because the Krork cannot forget. Humanity worships a machine god that may be a C'tan in chains. The Necrons rise again, not out of malice, but out of mission. They are not invaders, they are the landlords returning to evict the squatters. And the galaxy, already burning under the fires of the 42nd millennium, is not ready. The stars remember. The warp howls with the echoes of old sins. The dead have awakened, and the war that began before time now burns again in silence and shadow. The war in heaven was only the first act. The final act has already begun.